So we're picking up with the last couple of, or few, terms and concepts that we didn't quite cover from Chapter 1. And what I hadn't gotten to was this pair, race and ethnicity. And race and ethnicity are sort of intertangled terms and concepts. The first thing to know, and your book says this, I just want to reiterate, is that race is in fact a social construct as much as the notion of masculinity and femininity are. Race is also a social construct. When we define race, by and large, what we're talking about are identifiable physical characteristics. The tone of a person's skin, the color and the nature of hair, possibly features of the body, maybe eye color, right? That seems to be, when we identify people by race, that's often what we're doing it by. There is no real genetic component to race. When we look at DNA, there is, this phrase will sound familiar to you from research on gender, there is as much variety within supposed races as there are between, which is to say that you cannot look at the DNA of a person who we identify as black or a person we identify as being Arabic and the DNA of a person we identify as white. We'll see as many differences, at least as many differences, right, within those categories as we see between those categories. So race is in fact a social construct. Doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, because racism, for instance, is very real. Racial bias is very real. But race is largely about identifiable physical characteristics, but it's a social construct. So that's often how we talk about race. Ethnicity, and your book gets at this, right, that we often think about people with shared cultural traditions and past. And so you can see how those terms, why we might use those terms sort of interchangeably. For many of us who are white, this is sort of difficult to think about and understand, because people who are white sometimes have been slow to recognize themselves as, one, having a racial identity, and two, having an ethnicity, right? So, but it goes back to this thing about race being a social construct. And your book uses a reference actually to Russians, but a friend of mine, or a professor, now a friend of mine from grad school, says that when her parents married, they were considered to be an interracial marriage. They're an interracial marriage because her father was, I think, first generation U.S. citizen from an Italian family, and her mother was that from a German family. And it was considered interracial. So what is race has historically been very unstable in this country, even within the last 50, 60, 70 years. It's been very unstable here just in this country. But ethnicity, we may think of how many times white people think of as being sort of their ancestral heritage. I'm not saying this is ethnicity, but, for white people, again, so I am from German, primarily German, and some English. That is my background, which does not differ much, by the way, from dominant U.S. culture, because U.S. culture has been dominated by the traditions of Teutonic and Anglos, right. So German is strong German and English influence is what U.S. culture has had. And by the way, you don't have to know this for the exam, but the 1910 Immigration Act, for instance, set numbers for how many people from different countries could come in, heavily favoring those from English-speaking and German-speaking countries. I mean, there's like coded into law some of our laws, this preference. Anyway, but so with that, and then my sister married somebody whose family was predominantly Italian, and there have been some different traditions and history and food and languages followed with them. When I say language even, my sister's mother-in-law, actually her first language, though she's born here in the States, I believe she's born in the States, I could be wrong about that, her first language is Italian because her father never spoke English and her mother spoke only very little. Anyway, so that's an analog to it, but not really an example. Because being German is really not ethnicity. That's more of national heritage than being ethnicity. But it starts to get at that idea of cultural traditions and patterns. And for many white people in this country, it's hard to think of cultural traditions and patterns other than sort of what is just done. But ethnicity is much more, again, about people identifying themselves as being part of a group based on shared cultural and historical patterns, right? And again, for white people, it's just sort of the thing that we do, and may not recognize that so much. But whereas race is much more a category that's created largely based on people's physical makeup and appearance. And sometimes race has also been something that's been designated much more by the government than maybe the people themselves. So you get some of the political complexities, for instance, of the term Hispanic versus Latinx, right? So that, which, if it means something to you, great, and if not, I'm not going to get into it here just because I'm not trying to, I was going to move on. But if you do have questions about it or concerns about it or you want to speak about it, please, let's do that in class. Okay. And we talk about race and ethnicity. An important part about thinking about race and ethnicity is this notion of who is native, right? So we recognize now in this country Native Americans as being, who I grew up with, we simply call Indian. We called, right? But the idea that now they're Native Americans, people who are from the soil. Well, you have to understand, in the 19th century, even mid-19th century, those people who had been here for at least, their families been here for at least 2 generations, would consider themselves natives. And you go, oh, okay, well, that's sort of problematic in its own way. Oh, but wait, there's more, because they would consider themselves natives having only been here for a couple of generations, but might consider others whose family had been in this country for more generations as not being native because of their descent. And it could be, again, you were from German descent, been here for 2 or 3 generations, you saw yourself as native, but you say, knew somebody who was, and though English speaking, Irish, you might have not seen them as being native no matter how long their family had been here, and that has to do with some of the distinctions, or some of the political complexities in the history of the British and the Irish. So in the 19th century, you get this nativism. And there's just people who felt that if they were pretty much from England, Scotland, some, and then German-speaking countries, that was their sort of their heritage, familial heritage, and had been here for a couple of generations. They felt like they were natives of the country. So again, just saying that as we talk about race and ethnicity, it is a very complex topic. And so I often will say race and ethnicity. If I just say one, there's a very good chance I've just gotten lazy from saying the other word and not actually making a distinction there. We talked about this flag in class. I'm going to go ahead and move past it. All right. And then socioeconomic class. I think that one is pretty self-explanatory. I want to touch on it very briefly to say that it's not merely about how much money one makes. Socioeconomic class has to do with the standards, the social standards that are kept. Your book talks about the way that upper middle class standards have been enforced as appropriate conduct of acting like a lady and acting like a gentleman. The book talks about that. So socioeconomic class is not strictly about what is your income today, but those class norms as they're being enforced and those class positions with which people are associated. And socioeconomic class has been, as the book says, under-considered. I've said that before. I believe that very strongly, as our discussions of gender. Not that it should be considered above other points of identity, but we just haven't given as much consideration. So, for instance, when we talk about often the traditional family or traditional notions of mother, those are often highly classed notions of family and mother. The idea of the children at home, not just with a parent, but with a mother, and the mother being, we often have called a stay-at-home mom, right? Meaning she has no other employment outside of the home, right? That the care of the children in the house is her job. That is a class privilege to do that, right? That's a class privilege to do that, and we haven't recognized that. So women have been working outside the home for years and years as a matter of necessity. Working as maids, providing childcare, working as secretaries, working in laundry mills. I mean, they're doing a lot of work for a long, long time, but the notion that we have of mother has been about a mother in the home, not a mother outside the home, which is just a sign of a very strong class bias to what we think of and what we mean by mother and how we think of idealized motherhood. So that's socioeconomic class, just another sort of vector and circle there when you think about those overlapping rings of intersectionality.